Sarah Mitchell still remembers the exact sound the mud made when the first garbage bag hit the ground. It was not the soft thud of soil accepting a gift. It was the wet slap of ridicule, the kind of sound that makes neighbours lower their coffee cups and stare through kitchen windows. Inside that torn black plastic were 40 pounds of rotting potatoes, their skins weeping with fermentation, their eyes swollen with grey fuzz, their flesh turned to something between pudding and paste. She dragged 4 more bags from the bed of her rusted Ford Ranger, each one heavier with decay, and dumped them into the trenches she had spent 3 days digging across the southern 5 acres of her grandfather's abandoned farm. 200 potatoes in total. 200 soft, stinking, clearly worthless tubers that a local organic co-op had thrown out after a refrigeration failure. The manager had been happy to let her take them. He had even helped load them, shaking his head with that particular smile people reserve for the delusional. Sarah did not care. She had a theory that sounded insane even to her. A theory born from 3 months of reading her grandmother's handwritten journals by kerosene lamp, because the farm's electricity had been shut off again. She believed that rot was not the end. She believed that in the right soil, with the right patience, decay could become defense. The neighbors gathered that afternoon. Tom Hendricks from the property line to the east brought his son. The Becker brothers parked their combine and walked over with hands in their pockets. Even old Mrs. Gable, who had not left her porch since her hip surgery, stood at her railing with binoculars. They watched Sarah spread wood ash from her grandfather's old stove across the trench. They watched her sprinkle leaf mould she had collected from the creek bed. They watched her kick dirt over the bags of mush with her steel-toed boots, tamping it down like she was planting a crop of gold instead of garbage. Tom finally laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, but it was loud enough to carry across the fallow field. He turned to his son and said something Sarah could not hear, but she could read the words on his lips. Bless her heart. She has finally lost it. The wind that day carried the smell of those potatoes across 2 properties, a sweet sour odour that made the Becker brothers wrinkle their noses and hurry back to their equipment. Sarah stood in the field until they were all gone, until the only sound was the wind in the broken barn and the distant bark of a dog. She looked at the freshly turned earth and whispered an apology to her grandmother for taking so long to listen. Her hands were caked with mud and ash, and her back ached from 3 days of digging. But she felt something she had not felt in months. She felt like she was finally doing something that belonged to her. That was March 14th. By August 14th, those same 200 rotten potatoes would be worth more than every commercial harvest in Twin Falls County combined. Because when the Blight year hit Idaho, when the sky turned into a greenhouse of spores, and the Magic Valley became a graveyard of brown leaves and black stems, Sarah Mitchell's farm would be the only green thing left standing for miles. And the same men who laughed at her in March would be standing in her driveway in August, hats in hands, asking if she had any to spare. But I am getting ahead of myself. You cannot understand why a 34-year-old woman would bury garbage on her grandfather's dying farm until you understand what she had already lost. Sarah did not grow up wanting to be a farmer. She grew up wanting to be an agricultural economist, the kind of person who advised governments on food security and commodity pricing. She graduated from the University of Idaho with honors, took a position with a consulting firm in Boise, and spent 8 years telling farmers how to run their operations from a glass conference room. She was good at it. She could read a soil report like a novel and predict yields from satellite imagery with terrifying accuracy. She had a corner office, a fiancé named David who worked in commercial real estate, and a downtown loft with views of the foothills. She had dinner parties with friends who talked about stock portfolios and vacation homes. She had a gym membership she never used and a closet full of shoes she never wore. She had, by every conventional metric, succeeded at escaping the dirt. As a child, she had spent summers on this farm, chasing fireflies and eating peaches straight from the tree. She had forgotten how much that version of herself loved the smell of earth. Then her grandfather died. Elias Mitchell had farmed the same 1,200 acres outside of Twin Falls since 1962. He had survived the droughts of the 70s, the interest rate crashes of the 80s, and the commodity price collapses of the 90s. He had done it by being stubborn, by rotating crops when everyone else went monoculture, by saving his own seed when everyone else bought certified stock. But he could not survive time. The farm had been in decline for a decade before his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in his kitchen, a half-eaten piece of toast still on the plate. Sarah drove down from Boise that evening and walked the property for the first time in 6 years. What she saw broke something in her that the consulting reports had never touched. The barn roof had collapsed on one side. The irrigation ditches were choked with Russian thistle. The soil, which her grandfather had once described as black velvet, was grey and compacted, the result of decades of chemical shortcuts that had finally caught up with the land. And then there was the debt. Elias had mortgaged the equipment to pay medical bills. He had taken a second lien against the land itself to cover property taxes. The total came to $83,000, owed to a bank that had already sent a foreclosure notice dated for the end of the quarter. Sarah sat on the porch that night and listened to the wind move through the broken barn. She thought about her corner office. She thought about David, who had already texted her twice, asking when she was coming back to Boise so they could finalize the wedding venue. She thought about the life she had built, which suddenly felt like a very expensive costume she had been wearing for a decade. She called her boss the next morning and resigned. She called David that evening and told him she was staying. He did not argue. He simply said, in the flat voice of someone who had already made up his mind, that he had not signed up to be a farmer's husband. The engagement ring went back in its box. The loft was sublet. Sarah Mitchell moved into her grandfather's farmhouse on the 1st of January, with $300 in her checking account, a degree in agricultural theory, and absolutely no practical experience running a farm. The first tragedy was not the debt. The debt was just math. The first tragedy was the soil itself. Sarah hired a company to test the organic matter content, and when the results came back, she sat at the kitchen table and cried. 0.8%. For context, healthy agricultural soil should have between 3 and 5% organic matter. 0.8 meant the soil was basically mineral dust held together by chemical residue. It meant that every raindrop that hit the ground ran off instead of soaking in. It meant that the millions of microorganisms that make soil alive had been annihilated by decades of synthetic fertilizers and broad-spectrum pesticides. The test also showed that the cation exchange capacity, which measures how well soil holds nutrients, was less than half the minimum viable threshold. The pH had drifted to 8.4, making most micronutrients chemically unavailable to plants. Sarah had spent her entire career telling other people how to fix their soil, and now she stood on her own land and realized that every textbook answer she knew was too slow, too expensive, or too gentle for the reality she faced. She needed a miracle, and she needed it in one growing season, or the bank would take the farm before she ever had a chance to heal it. She lay awake at night, calculating interest rates and seed costs, wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life by coming back. The second tragedy came in February, when the irrigation pump failed. Sarah had budgeted carefully, allocating her remaining cash to seed potatoes and a minimal amount of fertilizer. She had planned to run drip lines from the old well, which her grandfather had maintained religiously. But the pump, which was 40 years old, seized one morning and died, with a sound like a gunshot. The replacement cost was $4,000. The installation cost was another $2,000. Sarah did not have $6,000. She spent 3 days calling every agricultural extension office, every equipment co-op, every church group in the county. She called her old colleagues in Boise, people who had once taken her recommendations seriously, and they offered sympathy but no cash. She finally found a used pump in Jerome, but by the time she got it installed, she had lost 2 critical weeks of planting time. The potatoes went into cold, wet soil that had not been properly prepared. They sat there for 10 days before germinating, and when they finally emerged, they were pale and spindly, already behind schedule before they ever saw sunlight. The third tragedy was the loneliness. Sarah had not expected farming to be social. She had expected hard work and isolation, but she had not expected the way the community would turn its back on her. She was not one of them, not really. She was a Boise girl with a college degree who had shown up in a Subaru with plans to save a farm that real farmers had already written off. At the feed store, conversations went quiet when she walked in. At the diner, booths filled mysteriously when she approached. Tom Hendricks, who had been her grandfather's neighbor for 30 years, waved from his truck but never stopped to talk. The message was clear. They did not think she would last. They did not think she belonged. And worst of all, deep in her darkest moments, Sarah was not sure they were wrong. By the end of her first spring, she had made every mistake a novice farmer can make. She planted her first crop of certified Russet Burbank seed potatoes in rows too close together because she was trying to maximize yield on limited acreage. When the plants emerged, they were overcrowded and competing for light. She applied synthetic fertilizer because she was afraid of the bank deadline, because she needed a crop and she needed it fast. The fertilizer pushed vegetative growth, creating lush green tops that looked beautiful from the road. Sarah actually smiled when she drove past the field. She took a photograph and sent it to her mother, the first hopeful moment since she had arrived. Then the heat came. Idaho summers are dry, but they are not supposed to be ovens in June. A high-pressure system parked over the state and did not move for 3 weeks. Daytime temperatures hit 105. The lush green tops, which had been forced by chemicals instead of supported by soil biology, could not handle the stress. They wilted. Then they browned. Then they died. Sarah dug test hills in July and found that the tubers, if they had formed at all, were the size of marbles. She harvested the field in August and filled exactly 12 sacks. 12 sacks from 5 acres. At market prices, she had earned less than $400 from a crop that had cost her $12,000 to plant. She sat in the empty barn that night and listened to the mice in the rafters. She had not cried when David left. She had not cried when she saw the soil test. But she cried then, because for the first time she understood that knowledge and desperation were not enough. That land did not care about her intentions. That she was not just failing. She was failing in front of everyone who had expected her to fail. The second failure came in September, when she tried to rebuild. She read about composting, about the way organic matter could restore soil structure if you just gave it time and the right materials. She found a farmer in Jerome who was selling aged manure, the kind of nitrogen-rich amendment that could jumpstart microbial activity. She spent her last $800 on 2 truckloads and spread it across the southern field, the same field where she would later bury the potatoes. She was so proud of that manure. She took a video of it steaming in the morning light. She did not know that the farmer had fed his cattle hay treated with aminopyralid, a broadleaf herbicide that passes through digestive systems unchanged. She did not know that this chemical, at parts per billion, could destroy broadleaf plants for years. She planted a cover crop of clover and vetch to hold the soil through winter. 2 weeks after germination, the seedlings twisted. Their leaves curled into corkscrews. They stopped growing entirely. Sarah sent samples to the university lab and waited 3 weeks for the answer. When it came, she felt the kind of despair that hollows you out. The manure was contaminated. The field was poisoned. Not dead forever, but dead for this season, and maybe the next. She had spent her last dollars to make her soil worse. The third failure was the loan. Sarah had one asset left. Her grandfather's old John Deere tractor, a 1985 model that still ran if you knew which levers to jiggle. She drove it to the bank in Twin Falls, not to use as collateral, but to show them she was serious. She wore her only suit, the one she had kept from her consulting days. She sat across from a loan officer who was younger than her and explained her plan. She needed $15,000 for a proper drip irrigation system. She needed it to reduce water waste, to deliver nutrients directly to root zones, to prove that the farm could be efficient and modern. She had spreadsheets. She had yield projections. She had a 5-year business plan that would have impressed her old bosses. The loan officer did not even open the folder. He looked at her credit report, which showed the farm debt, and no current income. He looked at her employment history, which ended 8 months ago. He said the words that Sarah would hear in her nightmares for years. "You are not a good risk, Ms. Mitchell. We cannot help you." She drove the tractor home at 30 miles per hour, the wind tearing at her suit jacket. And when she pulled into the driveway, she sat in the cab for an hour and could not make herself open the door. She had failed 3 times. She had no money. She had no allies. She stared at the foreclosure notice on her kitchen table until the words stopped making sense. She had a farm that was dying and a bank that was waiting. And then, on a Thursday morning in early March, she found the potatoes. She had gone to the co-op to beg for damaged seed, anything they could not sell that she might try to nurse back to life. The manager, a kind man named Robert, who had watched her grandfather farm for decades, took her to the back-loading dock. There they were, 5 garbage bags of potatoes that had been stored in a cooler that failed over a holiday weekend. They were soft to the point of liquefaction. Their skins sloughed off when you touched them. The smell was sweet and alcoholic, the scent of cellular death. Robert was going to haul them to the municipal compost pile. Sarah looked at them and felt something she could not explain. Her grandmother's journals, which she had been reading every night by lamplight, contained a passage about the old ways. About how her grandmother's mother, during the hard years of the Depression, had buried spoiled vegetables in trenches with ash and leaf mold, not to grow them, but to summon the soil back to life, to feed the fungi, to invite the bacteria that commercial agriculture had spent a century trying to sterilize away. The journals described how the ash provided potassium and raised pH, how the leaf mold inoculated the trench with native decomposers, and how the decaying matter created a thermal pulse that woke up sleeping soil communities. Sarah had read that passage a dozen times and dismissed it as nostalgia. But standing there on the loading dock with nothing left to lose, and no scientific solution within reach, nostalgia felt like a lifeline. She asked Robert if she could have them. He looked at her like she had asked to drink the juice at the bottom of the bags. Then he shrugged and helped her load them. She buried them that afternoon. She dug trenches 18 inches deep, lined them with the ash from her grandfather's stove, layered in leaf mold she had scraped from the creek bed, where cottonwoods dropped their leaves every autumn. She placed the potatoes in the earth, not as seed, but as an offering. She covered them, and she waited, and the neighbors laughed. Before we get to what happened when the Blight clouds rolled over Twin Falls County, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your state or country in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. I have a feeling this one is going to reach people who need to hear it. Now, back to Idaho. The spring of 2023 started wrong and got worse. Idaho potato farmers watch the weather the way sailors watch the horizon. They know that late blight, the same disease that caused the Irish potato famine, is always waiting in the wings. It needs only two things: moisture and cool temperatures between 60 and 70 degrees. Most years, Idaho's dry climate is the defense. The arid air keeps the spores from germinating. But that spring, a La Nina pattern shifted the jet stream, and storm after storm rolled through the Magic Valley. The soil stayed wet. The humidity climbed into ranges that Idaho had not seen in decades. By late May, agricultural extension officers were sending warnings. By early June, the first lesions appeared on commercial fields. Late blight moves fast. A single infected plant can produce hundreds of thousands of spores in a day. The spores travel on wind currents, on tractor tires, on rain splash. They do not care about property lines. They do not care about insurance policies. They land on potato leaves, penetrate the tissue, and within 72 hours, the leaf turns brown and dies. From there, it moves into the stems. From the stems, it reaches the tubers. Infected tubers rot in the ground, turning to mush before harvest. The conventional response is chemical warfare. Farmers sprayed fungicides every 5 to 7 days. They used chlorothalonil, mancozeb, cymoxanil, rotating modes of action to prevent resistance. They sprayed at midnight, at dawn, whenever the wind dropped below 10 miles per hour. The helicopters and ground rigs ran constantly. The cost was enormous. Some farmers spent more on fungicide that summer than they had spent on seed and fertilizer combined, and it did not work. The weather was too perfect for the disease. The humidity was too high. The spores found every gap in the chemical shield. By the 4th of July, fields that had been green and vigorous in May looked like they had been hit with a flamethrower. Brown patches expanded across the landscape like ink on paper. Men who had farmed for 40 years stood at field edges with tears in their eyes, watching lifetimes of work dissolve into black slime. The Becker brothers found their father sitting in the cab of his idling truck at midnight, unable to face the house, because he had to tell his wife they had lost everything. Farmers stood at field edges and watched their livelihoods turn to compost before their eyes. The USDA declared Twin Falls County a natural disaster area on July 9th. Sarah watched it happen from her porch. She watched the helicopters spray Tom Hendricks Field to the east. She watched the Becker brothers tear out their crop in early July, trying to salvage something by turning the potatoes into cattle feed before they rotted. She watched the local news report projected yield losses of 60 to 80% across the southern Idaho potato belt, and she waited. She placed her palm on the cool earth and felt warmth rising from the trenches, the first sign that something beneath was answering her call, because something impossible was happening in her southern field. The trenches where she had buried the rotten potatoes had sunk slightly, creating long, shallow depressions in the soil. From above, they looked like scars, but at ground level, they were teeming. The fermentation of 200 pounds of potato tissue had created a biological explosion. The soil temperature in those trenches was 5 degrees warmer than the surrounding ground. The ash had raised the pH just enough to favour beneficial bacteria. The leaf mould had introduced native fungal networks, and the potatoes themselves, even in death, had released nutrients in a slow cascade that fed an entire ecosystem beneath the surface. Sarah had not planted anything in those trenches. She had been too discouraged after the aminopyralid disaster to risk another crop. But in April, she had noticed volunteer sprouts emerging along the trench lines. Potato plants growing from eyes that had somehow survived the rot, or from tiny tubers she had missed. She had almost pulled them. They were not in rows. They were not part of any plan. But she had left them because at that point, hope was too expensive to throw away. By June, those volunteer plants were knee-high and dark green. By July, while every other field in the county was turning brown, they were still green. Not just green, vibrant. The leaves were thick and waxy. The stems were sturdy. Sarah walked the trenches with her heart pounding, expecting to find lesions, expecting to see the telltale white fuzz of sporulation on the undersides of leaves. She found nothing. She sent samples to the same university lab that had diagnosed her contaminated manure. The results came back in 3 days, and she read them sitting in her truck because her hands were shaking too hard to drive. The plants were infected with Phytophthora infestans. The blight spores had landed on them, just as they had landed on every other plant in the county. But the infection had not progressed. The lesions were microscopic and contained. The plant's natural defenses, supercharged by the microbial richness of the soil around them, had walled off the pathogen. It was not immunity, it was resistance. And it was happening in soil that had tested at 0.8% organic matter 18 months earlier. Sarah did not understand the full science then. She understands it now. The fermentation of the potatoes had produced volatile organic compounds that stimulated native Bacillus subtilis populations. The ash had provided minerals that strengthened plant cell walls. The leaf mold had introduced mycorrhizal fungi that colonized the potato roots and acted as an early warning system, triggering defense responses before the blight could establish. The increased soil organic matter improved water retention, reducing the leaf wetness that blight needs to spread. The diverse microbial community simply outcompeted the pathogen for resources and space. But in July of 2023, Sarah did not need to understand the science. She needed to understand that she had 427 volunteer potato plants growing in trenches that the agricultural establishment would have a garbage dump. And every single one of them was surviving the worst blight outbreak in Idaho history. She did not tell anyone at first. She was afraid it was a fluke. She was afraid that if she talked about it, the disease would find her too. She tended those plants like they were children, hand-weeding around them, carrying water in buckets, because her drip system was still a dream. By late July, the commercial harvest was essentially over. Farmers who had not sprayed were looking at total losses. Farmers who had sprayed were looking at 30 to 40% salvage, potatoes that would grade poorly and sell for less than the cost of production. The Becker brothers came by in early August, their faces weathered and hollow. They did not ask for help. They just sat on her porch and looked at her field, which was still green, and they did not say anything for a long time. Then Tom Hendricks came. He walked the southern field with her, his boots sinking into the rich dark soil that had been grey dust 2 years ago. He knelt and pulled a plant, and the tubers that came up with it made him swear softly. They were perfect, smooth skin, no lesions, no rot. He looked up at Sarah with an expression she had never seen from him before. It was not friendship. It was not even respect, not yet. It was the dawning realization that he had been wrong, that the woman he had laughed at in March had somehow, impossibly, found a door that every expert in the county had missed. Sarah harvested those 427 plants by hand in mid-August. She worked from dawn to dusk for 9 days, her back screaming, her hands blistered, her grandfather's old wheelbarrow creaking under loads she had never thought possible. She kept count as she filled the burlap sacks. 100 sacks, 200, 300. When she finally stacked them in the barn, she had 8,437 pounds of potatoes. Potatoes from plants that should not have existed. Potatoes from soil that should not have been able to grow weeds, let alone a crop. Potatoes that had survived a disease that had destroyed millions of dollars of commercial agriculture across the state. She sold the first 2,000 pounds at a premium to a restaurant collective in Boise that specialized in heritage and locally grown food. The chef who bought them wept when she told him the story, and he put those potatoes on the menu at $40 a plate. They paid her $4 a pound, 16 times the commodity rate, because these were not commodity potatoes. They were a story. They were proof. They were the only Idaho potatoes that had not been bathed in fungicide that summer. With that money, she bought the drip irrigation system the bank had denied her. She bought seed stock for the following spring, not certified russets, but the progeny of her volunteers, which she had carefully selected for the traits that had saved them. She hired a soil consultant, not from the university this time, but from a regenerative agriculture network in North Dakota, who taught her how to replicate what she had accidentally discovered. By the spring of 2024, Sarah's farm was unrecognizable. The southern field, which had been a symbol of her failure, was now covered in long, neat rows of heritage potatoes, grown from the seed she had saved. She planted them using the same trench method, but now she understood it. She added biochar to hold the microbial communities. She inoculated with specific fungal strains. She planted companion crops of marigold and nasturtium between rows to attract predatory insects. She installed owl boxes to control the rodent population naturally. She built a small greenhouse to start her own seedlings, eliminating the need to buy commercial starts. She planted hedgerows of native shrubs to create windbreaks. The farm that had been grey and silent was now buzzing with pollinators. The soil that had tested at 0.8% organic matter now tested at 4.2%. The water that had run off in sheets now soaked in within minutes. Sarah did not just have a crop. She had a system. Birds she had never seen before began nesting in the hedgerows. Dragonflies patrolled. The farm was becoming an ecosystem instead of a factory, and the county noticed. By the summer of 2024, farmers were coming to her farm not to laugh, but to learn. Tom Hendricks was the first. He brought soil samples from his own fields, which had been blight-scarred and chemically dependent for decades. Sarah walked him through the trenches. She showed him the fungal networks that you could actually see when you dug into the earth, white threads like lace connecting plant roots to soil particles. She explained that the potatoes she had buried were not seed. They were a message to the soil. A message that said, "I will feed you first. I will trust the biology. I will stop trying to dominate the land and start trying to partner with it." Tom went home and stopped spraying. It took him 3 years to fully transition, but he did it. The Becker brothers came next, then the Gables, then farmers from Jerome and Gooding and Cassia counties. Sarah started holding workshops in her barn, which she finally repaired with the profits from her second harvest. She called them Soil Sundays, and by 2025, they were attracting 200 people from 5 states. She taught them how to test their own soil, how to make fermented plant extracts, how to read the weeds that grew in their fields as diagnostic tools. She never charged for them. She said that the land had given her a second chance, and she would spend the rest of her life paying it forward. She started a small scholarship fund for children of farm workers who wanted to study agriculture, using 10% of her annual profits to pay it forward. The numbers tell the rest of the story. In 2023, the Blight year, Sarah Mitchell harvested 8,437 pounds of potatoes from less than half an acre of volunteer plants. In 2024, her first full season using the regenerative system she had discovered, she harvested 42,000 pounds from 5 acres, selling at an average of $2.50 a pound to restaurants, farmers markets, and a seed cooperative that supplied heritage varieties to home gardeners across the Pacific Northwest. In 2025, she expanded to 12 acres, hired 3 full-time employees from the local community, and grossed $340,000. Her soil organic matter reached 5.1%, a number that soil scientists told her was nearly impossible to achieve in 3 years on formerly degraded land. Her farm became a demonstration site for the State Extension Service, and universities now send graduate students to study her soil biology. But the number that matters most to Sarah is not on any spreadsheet. It is the number of farms that have transitioned away from chemical dependency because of what started in those trenches. As this recording, 17 farms in southern Idaho have adopted her trench fermentation method. 360 acres that were once sprayed with fungicides every week are now managed with biology. The Extension Office, which had once dismissed her as a well-meaning amateur, now collaborates with her on research trials. The bank that denied her loan now sends agricultural borrowers to her farm for inspiration. And those 200 rotten potatoes, the ones that made Tom Hendricks laugh on a March afternoon, are now the genetic foundation of a potato variety that the Idaho Heritage Seed Sanctuary calls Mitchell's Resilient, named for her grandfather, not because it is immune to blight, but because it knows how to survive it. Sarah still lives in her grandfather's farmhouse. She still drives the rusted Ford Ranger, though now it starts on the first try because she could finally afford to fix the starter. She still reads her grandmother's journals by lamplight, though now the electricity stays on. and she still buries things in trenches. Every spring, she takes the damaged produce from her own harvest, the potatoes that do not meet market grade, the ones with blemishes or odd shapes, and she buries them in new trenches across the farm. The neighbors do not laugh anymore. They help her dig, because they have learned what Sarah learned. That rot is not the enemy. That decay is just transformation wearing a mask that frightens us. That the things we throw away, the things we deem worthless and broken and past saving, often contain exactly the life force we need to rebuild. Sarah Mitchell was not a genius. She was not a miracle worker. She was a woman who had lost everything, who had been laughed at by men who knew more than she did about conventional farming, and who had still chosen to trust the soil more than she trusted the experts. She buried 200 rotten potatoes because she had no other options left. And the soil, which had been waiting for someone to believe in it, finally had someone who would listen. The Blight year did not break her. It revealed her. It showed an entire county that there is a difference between controlling the land and understanding it. That there is a difference between killing every pathogen and building a system so alive that disease cannot take hold. That there is a difference between being laughed at and being wrong. Sarah Mitchell was laughed at, but she was not wrong. And if you are watching this, if you are sitting somewhere right now with a dream that everyone around you thinks is foolish, if you are holding something in your hands that looks rotten and useless and broken, let this story be your permission. Bury it, plant it, trust the process that you cannot yet see. Because the same people who laugh at your trenches today will be the ones asking you for potatoes tomorrow. And when they do, when they show up at your door with hats in hands and questions in their eyes, remember Sarah. Remember the mud. Remember the smell of 200 rotting potatoes on a March wind. And then invite them in. Show them the soil. Show them what happens when you stop fighting the land and start feeding it. The comment section is open. If this story reached you, if you are that person with the impossible dream, I want to hear about it. Tell me what you are planting. Tell me what they laughed at. Because I promise you, the Blight year is coming for all of us eventually. The question is not whether the storms will hit. The question is whether you have built something alive enough to survive them. I will be reading every comment.